Dalton Keene had always valued his solitude. His cabin standing alone at the edge of a barren, sun-scorched plain where travelers were rare and human contact even rarer. The kind of isolation that let a man think, breathe, and live uninterrupted. Yet one searing afternoon changed everything when Dalton spotted a lone Apache woman kneeling beside her wagon, hands desperately trying to repair a wheel split clean through the hub. Her focus so absolute she didn't call for help, didn't look up, her dark eyes locked on the broken wood as if sheer will could mend it. And despite knowing he should keep riding, Dalton felt compelled to halt his horse, dismounting and walking across the cracked earth with boots crunching dry soil underfoot. And when she finally lifted her gaze to meet his, he saw an intensity and steadiness in her dark, unreadable eyes, framed by loose black strands escaping her braid. Her traditional Apache clothing, decorated with turquoise stones that caught the harsh sunlight, reflecting flashes of blue, and though she showed no relief, no fear, he felt the weight of her presence, the unspoken evaluation of him as he approached the wagon. And without asking her name or offering words, he knelt beside the broken wheel, removing a piece of ironwood from his saddlebag and securing it with rawhide cord. Working with the efficiency of someone who had repaired countless broken things before, while she watched intently, memorizing each movement rather than expressing gratitude. And when the repair was complete, he brushed dust from his hands, and she tested the wheel, rolled it back and forth, then gave a single nod, silent and decisive, mounted her wagon, and drove off without looking back, leaving Dalton standing there, the heat beating down on his shoulders, dust settling around his boots. And though the moment had lasted barely 20 minutes, it was enough to linger in his mind as he returned to his cabin, unsaddled his horse, ate a cold meal, and slept too. The rhythm of wind scraping across the wooden walls, completely unaware that this simple act of help would soon set the stage for a confrontation beyond anything he had ever imagined. A test of his courage, wits, and survival, one that began with a broken wheel and an encounter on a dusty, deserted trail. Dalton woke before dawn to the sound of hooves pounding against the dry earth. Not one or two, but hundreds circling his cabin in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. And as adrenaline surged, he grabbed his rifle and peered through the gap. In his shudders, heart hammering against his ribs, only to be confronted by a sight no man should witness alone. An army of warriors, painted for battle, their chests bare despite the morning chill, bows drawn, arrows nocked, spears tipped with feathers swaying in the wind, forming perfect concentric rings around his small cabin, as if the earth itself had summoned them. And at the forefront sat the woman he had helped yesterday, mounted on a painted horse and flanked by two massive warriors whose sheer presence radiated authority. Her turquoise jewelry, catching the first rays of the sun, glinting like sparks against the dust, her expression carved from stone, unreadable and unyielding. And Dalton's mind raced with questions he could not answer. Had he offended her? Broken a law he didn't know existed? Something as simple as helping repair her wagon had led to this unimaginable moment of tension, and his rifle shook in his hands as he considered his options, knowing full well that hundreds of warriors could easily reduce his cabin to kindling before he even fired a shot. The mathematics of survival brutally simple and terrifyingly clear. Yet for reasons he could not fathom, they did not attack immediately, holding their positions as statues, waiting for something he could not understand, while his own pulse seemed to echo the thunder of hooves, sweat slicking his palms. And as he watched, one of the lead warriors raised a spear and slammed it into the ground, the sound reverberating like a gavel from some invisible judge. And Dalton realized with growing horror that he was trapped, surrounded, and under the watchful eyes of the woman he had helped, who sat at the center of this silent storm, commanding the circle, her gaze unwavering, her purpose hidden. And in that moment, Dalton understood that whatever was coming next would not be negotiable. It would demand his full attention, his wits, and perhaps more courage than he knew he possessed. Dalton's mind raced as he scanned the overwhelming scene, realizing that the circle of warriors had grown tighter, their horses shifting slightly, as if feeling his hesitation, and the sheer number of them, close to 400, made him wonder how anyone could survive such an encirclement. Yet he forced himself to breathe, trying to remain invisible behind the shutter, rifle resting cautiously against the frame, while his thoughts flickered to the woman he had helped, sitting tall and motionless atop her painted horse, her presence commanding the formation, her dark eyes fixed unwaveringly on his cabin. And as the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning chill, Dalton studied every detail, the arrangement of spears, the spacing of the riders, the faint rustle of leather, the subtle creak of saddles, realizing that even a single misstep could trigger chaos and certain death. Yet they made no aggressive move, holding instead a terrifying patience, like predators sizing up their prey. And Dalton considered his options: a futile shootout, a desperate escape across the open plain, or somehow attempting communication. But every scenario seemed hopeless, and as he gripped his rifle tighter, sweat running down his temple, he noticed a subtle shift at the center. The woman leaning forward slightly, signaling with a hand movement that was almost imperceptible, yet clearly understood by her two massive flankers, a silent command rippling through the ring of warriors. And Dalton felt a mixture of fear and awe, wondering if this was punishment, a test, or some ancient ritual he could not comprehend. His thoughts returning briefly to the previous day, to the wheel, the fleeting nod, the silence, realizing that a simple act of kindness had somehow transformed into a situation that defied explanation. And as the minutes stretched into an eternity, he felt the tension tighten around his chest, knowing that soon he would have to act, whether to survive, to reason, or to confront whatever judgment had been passed upon him. While the woman remained at the center, poised like a statue carved from the desert itself, turquoise stones sparkling, as she shifted slightly, signaling the readiness of her warriors. And Dalton understood that understanding her intentions would be the key to surviving the coming ordeal, though whether her aim was mercy, revenge, or something else entirely, he could not guess, leaving him trapped between fear and the faintest hope that the very act of repair he had performed the day before might somehow guide him through the storm he had never anticipated. Time stretched endlessly as Dalton remained crouched behind the shutter, his rifle resting lightly against the frame, while his eyes never left the woman at the center of the formation, whose dark, unreadable gaze seemed to weigh on him with the force of centuries of history, every movement measured, deliberate, a silent command that rippled outward through the hundreds of warriors encircling his cabin, their faces painted with red and black streaks, chests bare, bows drawn, and fingers resting lightly on the arrow shafts. creaking leather and shifting hooves, the only sounds breaking the suffocating silence. And Dalton felt the desert itself pressing in on him, the open plain suddenly a cage of anticipation, as he tried to decipher the meaning behind her unreadable stare, her turquoise jewelry glinting in the early sun, flashing signals he could not interpret, every small gesture tilt of the head, subtle shift of her horse, while his mind raced through possibilities. From a offense he didn't know he had committed, to some ancient law broken in ignorance, to a ritual testing courage, honor, and respect. And in that realization, Dalton felt the gravity of the situation deepen, his pulse hammering in rhythm with the silent heartbeat of the desert. The world narrowing to the single figure on the painted horse and the silent command she radiated. And then, almost imperceptibly, she raised a single hand, slicing through the air in a deliberate motion, a gesture that commanded absolute attention. From her flankers, the warriors immediately responding in perfect synchrony, tightening the circle ever so slightly, and signaling that this was not a random threat but a deliberate test, a silent demand, an expectation that Dalton could not yet understand. He swallowed hard, realizing that the next move he made, however small, would determine the outcome of this encounter, whether it ended in disaster or survival. And every muscle in his body tensed as he weighed options, none of which seemed safe, none of which he could predict would be interpreted correctly by the silent, vigilant leaders. And he realized that understanding the rules of this unspoken challenge was more crucial than any weapon or skill he possessed, that survival depended entirely on perception, timing, and respect. And as he steadied himself, he noticed subtle signs of patience and observation in her posture, the way her eyes shifted from him to the warriors and back. And in that instant, Dalton felt a mixture of fear, awe, and a strange admiration, knowing that the coming moments would test not his strength, but his ability to read, to respond, and to honor a culture and a power he barely understood, while the warriors remained statuesque, alert, yet still, their collective energy like a coiled spring. And Dalton knew that the slightest wrong move could unravel everything, but that the right one made with courage, intelligence, and respect might be his only path to survival. Dalton's mind raced as the tension tightened like a noose, every instinct screaming at him to act, yet every thought reminding him that any sudden movement could ignite disaster. And he watched as the woman on horseback began a subtle, deliberate series of gestures, shifting her weight, adjusting her reins, and slowly raising one arm in a command, so quiet yet precise that it seemed to ripple through the warriors, encircling his cabin like a wave, their movements almost imperceptibly synchronized, horses shifting in unison, muscles taut, eyes fixed on him with lethal precision. And Dalton's pulse hammered in rhythm with the pounding of his heart as he realized that this was a test, not of strength, but of perception, courage, and respect, that the act of helping her yesterday had unknowingly enrolled him in a ritual beyond his comprehension, a silent challenge of character and intent that he had no choice but to meet. And he considered every possibility, shooting, fleeing, negotiating, yet none seemed viable against the sheer force surrounding him. The hundreds of painted warriors, a wall of inevitability, while the desert stretched beyond, open and unforgiving, yet suddenly claustrophobic under the weight of expectation. And he noticed the turquoise stones at her neck and wrists catching the sunlight, flashing sparks like subtle signals only she understood, a language of authority and command, and Dalton realized that responding correctly would require not aggression but acknowledgement, not haste but awareness, not defiance but recognition, and with deliberate care he lowered his rifle just enough to signal observation without submission, feeling the sweat run down his temple, the muscles in his arms tense, every fiber of his being alert. And as he made this subtle gesture, the woman's eyes softened ever so slightly, though her posture remained commanding, and Dalton felt the first flicker of hope, a small signal that his courage, respect, and understanding might be enough to navigate this unknown trial. While the warriors continued to hold their positions, creating a living tableau of tension, readiness, and silent judgment, and in that moment, Dalton understood the profound truth of the encounter. Survival and honor often relied not on firepower, numbers, or brute force, but on the ability to perceive the subtle signals, to act with care and respect, and to demonstrate courage in the face of overwhelming odds. And as he held himself steady, the woman's gaze remained locked on him, silently measuring, silently guiding, silently offering a chance to prove that his intentions had been true, that he could rise to the unspoken challenge, and that his future, however uncertain, rested in the delicate balance of awareness, courage, and humility, making each heartbeat a test of character. As the desert around them waited in quiet anticipation, Dalton's chest heaved as he kept his rifle lowered, every nerve in his body taut, every heartbeat echoing in the still morning air. And then, almost imperceptibly, the woman on horseback leaned forward slightly, giving a subtle, deliberate nod, a motion so quiet yet so commanding that it passed immediately to the two massive flankers beside her, and then rippled outward through the hundreds of warriors encircling his cabin. And Dalton watched in stunned disbelief as the tension that had held the desert hostage began to ease, bows lowering, horses relaxing, fingers uncurling from taut arrow shafts, and the warriors shifted from lethal readiness to controlled vigilance, a wave of restraint washing over the formation. Yet the woman remained at the center, her posture absolute, her gaze sharp, unwavering, turquoise jewelry flashing in the sunlight like sparks of authority and power, signaling that, though this encounter had not yet ended, she had granted him mercy, a reprieve earned through observation, courage, and respect. And Dalton felt a mixture of relief, awe, and humility flooding through him, understanding that his simple act of kindness, yesterday repairing her wagon wheel, offering help without expectation or reward, had been seen, measured, and judged, and in this quiet, profound way, it had earned him survival, a recognition of character far more powerful than any gun, any defense, any escape. And as the warriors began to slowly disperse, their movements deliberate and disciplined, dust rising in soft clouds around the desert plain, the woman finally shifted her reins, turning her horse toward the horizon, her figure silhouetted against the rising sun, commanding, untouchable, yet leaving behind a lesson more potent than any spoken word. And Dalton felt the weight of that lesson settle deep in his bones, the realization that courage, humility, respect, and awareness often outweighed force and numbers, that true survival depended on the delicate balance between action and perception, and that the choices one made, those seemingly small and inconsequential, could echo far beyond the immediate moment, creating chains of consequence and understanding across cultures and landscapes he could never fully comprehend. And as he watched the dust settle, the horizon wide and empty once more, Dalton lowered his rifle fully, letting the tension drain from his body, his mind awash with the lessons of the encounter. And he understood that he had not only survived a test of skill and courage, but had been granted a rare glimpse into the deep, intricate web of respect, authority, and tradition that governed the people he had encountered, leaving him forever changed, reflective, and quietly grateful. Standing alone at the cabin door, eyes fixed on the empty horizon, aware that the desert had tested him, judged him, and in its own solemn, merciful way had chosen to spare him, teaching him the profound power of integrity, patience, and the courage to act rightly even when the outcome was unknown.